Tell us about your life partner, Mary Butz.
Well, Mary is a wonderful person. She had a great career in the New York City public schools. She was a teacher for many years. She was a principal and founded her own high school. She was part of the Deborah Meyer Network, the Coalition of Essential Schools. And, you know, she was very focused on kids. So we never really talked about big issues. I mean, the kinds of things I always had my head wrapped around was not what she cared about. What she cared about was Maria's having a problem. Raheem doesn't have a shirt to wear. His grandmother kicked him out. Let's go to Costco and buy him some clothes. I mean, she was focused on the kids. She was focused on her faculty, making sure that her staff was had the support that they needed. And she created a terrific school. Her school, which is Manhattan Village Academy, she created a slogan: reason, respect, and responsibility. That was her school's mission statement. The kids all took college preparatory classes. Even though it was a small school, I think she had a little over 300 students, maybe 320 students. She started offering 3 languages, Spanish, French, and Latin. She eventually had to cut it down to, I think, Spanish and Latin, but she insisted that she had to keep the Latin. She wanted the kids to have that opportunity. She's a product of 16 years of Catholic school, and through her I've become a great admirer and supporter of Catholic education, which always seems inconsistent to my friends who know that I'm a great supporter of public education.
Schools, sure.
But I've evolved a principle that makes it consistent for me, and that is public money for public schools and private money for non-public schools. And if all the private money now pouring into public schools were there to help Catholic education, they'd be in great shape.
She says you are best friends who can depend on each other through thick and thin. You are life partners whose lives and families are totally intertwined. Tell us about your intertwined family.
We just spent Thanksgiving with her family in upstate New York. We'll spend Christmas at her family in Cranford, New Jersey. She's my youngest grandson, who's now 5 years old, totally adores her. I wanted him to call me Grandma, so he couldn't say that, so I'm Amma. She wanted to be called Oma because it's a German word for grandmother, so we're Oma and Amma. And when we go play with Elijah and take care of and babysit for him, I sometimes don't have the energy, but she plays with him. And so he adores her. And she was there, we were both there when he was born in San Jose, California. And, we share family events. Our families are indeed intertwined.
She says you're a family gal. She also notes that while you make great breakfast foods and salads, as a rule, the kitchen is not your area of expertise.
This is definitely true.
Yes.
I mean, there are limits to what I can do, and this is definitely one of them.
What happened with the vegetable soup to which you added barley?
That was one of the great stories, which she remembers, but I usually don't remember it because it was so humiliating.
You blocked it out?
Well, I offered to make dinner one night when I had some college friend whom I hadn't seen in, 20 years was coming for dinner. And I said, don't worry, I'll make dinner. And I was going to make this wonderful barley soup, which I guess I had never made, or I was remembering from maybe my childhood. But then when I made the soup, the barley started expanding and expanding and expanding. And when I dished it out, you could put your spoon in it and the spoon would stand up. So it wasn't exactly a soup. I'm not quite sure what you'd call it.
Did you serve it?
It was all we had. And I never saw that friend again.
They never came back.
No.
Your friend Richard Rothstein notes that he has learned a great deal from you over the many years, even when you both did not see as eye to eye on many issues as you do today. He notes that your prior works have influenced him greatly, specifically The Great School Wars, The Troubled Crusade, and The Language Policy. Of the books that you've written...
Language Police.
Language Police. Of the books you've written, of which are you most proud?
Well, I'd have to say that the book that has changed my life is The Death and Life of the Great American School System. And I never expected, that book came out in March of 2010, and I was then, like 72 years old, something like that. And I did not expect, at that point in my life, what would happen to me, which has been a dramatic life change. I mean, it's been like nothing I've ever experienced. But the book that was the most fun for me that I absolutely loved writing was The Language Police. The Language Police was, I remember when I went out to meet with different publishers, and it was eventually published by Knopf. And I sat down with they said, well, tell us about the book. The PR people want to know how would you describe it? And I said, this is the closest thing to automatic writing that I've ever experienced. And this idea of automatic writing was something that was popular, I guess, in the 1920s, where people would just sit down and do stream of consciousness. Well, of course, you know, you have to have lots and lots of background in order to do what's called stream of consciousness. And in this case, I had been working on the National Assessment Governing Board, and President Clinton and Secretary Riley had appointed me to it and reappointed me to it. So I served on it for 7 years. And while I was serving on the board, we had responsibility for a while for what might or might not, and did not become a national test. But there was a $50 million contract that went out to a group of publishers, to all the publishers, and they all combined into one and said, we will develop the voluntary national test. And so NAGB was overseeing this. And I remembered when we met with the publishers and they were telling us about what the guidelines would be and what they would do. They gave us a written document. It was about maybe 40 or 50 pages. And I sat down to read this, and it said, words you can't mention, phrases you can't mention, ideas you can't mention. And I looked at this and I thought, good grief, this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. Why can't you say Halloween? I mean, kids have Halloween all over America. Why can't you mention a dinosaur? Why can't you have a story with disobedient children? I mean, so all these things just kind of were amazing to me. And then I began, you know, kind of given my love of research and my historical bent, I began searching around, and I discovered McGraw-Hill actually had published guidelines, and they looked remarkably like the ones that I had just been given by the test publishers. And then I began contacting other test publishers and saying, do you have guidelines? And sometimes they would say yes, and sometimes they'd say no. If they said yes, they would send them to me. Most of them said no, but I knew that they had them and they wouldn't send them to me. Or they'd say, yes, we have them and you can't see them. And then I went through, I don't know how many months of just gathering guidelines from all over. And in some cases I had to do it because I had a tip that somebody was able to get them for me. And I accumulated all this stuff. And then I began reading about the history of censorship and thought, wow, this is so amazing. I mean, because the thing is, unlike so much of the historical research that I would typically do, all this stuff was just fascinating. I mean, there wasn't anything I read that didn't make my eyes pop. And sometimes there'd be funny stories, and sometimes it would be, I can't believe we're doing this. You know, that we're saying that children can't ever encounter a story about death. I mean, life and death. Part of the cycle of life is death. But no, you can't ever mention that. And then the more I got into it, the more people would come forward and offer me new stories. And so I had an editor at Time for Kids say, let me show you the photographs we're not allowed to print. And he sent me a whole group of photographs of things like a rainbow. I said, why not a rainbow? He said, well, that suggests gay. I said, oh, okay. And then there's another picture with a guy with his hand in his pocket. He said, what's his hand doing in his pocket? And then there's a picture of a child in poverty somewhere in some third world country. And he said, well, you're not allowed to show poverty in a third world country. But I said, but poverty exists in third world countries. It even exists here. No, you can't show poverty. That would make children feel bad.
These are all the things we should care about.
But you can't show it. You
Right.
can't depict it. And so I had this whole bunch of stuff from him, and, you know, other people send me. And so I just accumulated this wonderful archive. And I wrote the book, and it got a lot of attention. And I had so much fun talking about it. And it was the kind of book where you don't know whether to laugh or to cry. And even after it came out, I kept getting even more stuff that I had wished that I had had the first time around.
Oh, sure.
But how pervasive this is, and I guess what struck me at the end was we live in this absolutely untrammeled, unrestrained culture, popular culture, where kids can turn on TV and see, you know, virtually pornography, and certainly
Right.
death and terrorism and poverty and suicide, and I mean, abortion and everything that you can think of that they're not allowed to see on a test, or in many cases in textbooks. Like the word E will hardly ever appear in a textbook. The word E is evolution. Mm-hmm. But so anyway, I tried to bring both some history into it and also the guidelines, and I love doing that book. Mm. And as I say, by the time I had gathered all this stuff, I just sat down and I was writing, and it was like, boom, it wrote itself. But that was fun. The Death and Life was a different kind of book because it was a book that where I really had to kind of examine myself very deeply and kind of scrape down to the bottom and say, hey, you know what? I try to know what I'm talking about, and I have to admit I was wrong. I have to say a lot of things that I thought would work didn't work, and I have to make up for it. And I have, since writing the book, had just amazing experiences. First of all, going out and speaking and getting this incredible reaction, particularly from teachers, but also parents, but mostly teachers, and also administrators. Anybody who works in schools, where I have, at the end, people just jump to their feet and I get a standing ovation, and I think, I've just told them a terrible, depressing story. Why are they applauding? But that's been amazing. And then the kind of pushback has been, I've gotten a lot of really angry, vicious responses of, how dare you, how could you, you betrayed your principles, you have no principles. You used to say this, now you say that, you're a hypocrite. So there was a lot of that. So both the very high and very low. And, you're not even a good historian. Your credentials are no good.
Wow, I didn't know the other side of that. Mm-hmm. Many recognize you as the former No Child Left Behind advocate turned critic. According to Linda, this has been your greatest triumph because you dared to speak truth to power, and you had the courage to change your mind very publicly. Your son Michael noted this as your most significant accomplishment, as well as your writing. Americans today tend to be divided into camps, this is according to Michael, and there's enormous pressure not to betray solidarity with your fellow partisans. You looked honestly at what was happening around the country under the rubric of education reform and acknowledged that it was nothing like the vision of good education you had been advocating for your entire life. It's profound, it's phenomenal what you've done there. What are your thoughts about the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, and what was your bet with Richard Rothstein?
Well, my thoughts about No Child Left Behind are that, first of all, that they're tinkering with a very bad law. And I supported No Child Left Behind, but then so did more than 90% of the Congress, including, Senator Ted Kennedy and George Miller of California. And the people who supported it then have never been able to say what I've said. I've said that the law was a disaster. They don't say that. They say it just needs fixing. It needs tinkering around the edges. And I think I'd say that, if you step back and you recognize here's a law that by the year 2011 has caused 80% of our public schools to be labeled failures. If it stays as it is by the year 2014, virtually every school in the country will be called a failure. So you have to say, is it the schools that are failing, or is it the Congress's law that's failing? And I think this is a law that's a disaster. I've been criticized for saying it's the Death Star of American education. I think it is the Death Star of American education. It is dragging down every school into test, comply, or die. I think that's wrong. I think that's a way overreach of what Congress knows and can do, and a federal authority. I think that it's brought about federal control of the schools in a way that was never intended when the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed in 1965. And the law doesn't work. It doesn't. It has had so much collateral damage and so much negative stuff that it's generated and incentivized. And it's got everybody now, almost everybody, focused solely on data and numbers, regardless of the validity and of the numbers themselves. But treating data as though the data is itself the purpose of schooling. And if we can just get the data right, then everything else is okay. Forgetting that, gosh, pick up the business page almost any day of the week and see how often the data is played with, manipulated, distorted in order to hit the numbers, and forgetting what the purpose of the organization is. So I think that we have, NCLB has caused us as a nation to lose sight of the meaning, the purpose, the goals of education. And the way it should be reauthorized is, first of all, to restore it as the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, not of 1965, but let's say of 2012 or 2013, and remove from it all the accountability provisions, because it's totally inappropriate, in my view, for Congress to set any kind of accountability goals. I just think that if you can't trust the states to want to have better schools, then we're a very sorry nation indeed. If the only body that can establish accountability goals is the Congress of the United States, that's a tremendous statement of let's say, a repeal of federalism. So I think the states should control their own definitions of accountability, and we need to change the definition of accountability. Accountability today has become a synonym for punishment. So what I would like to see with the reauthorization is to eliminate everything that's called No Child Left Behind, eliminate the idea that the federal government should mandate testing goals, and leave the states to control their own testing programs, and make the federal role what it ought to be, which is to level the playing field, to direct resources to the neediest kids, to make sure that the children who are poor, the children with disabilities, the children with language needs, have the resources they need, and their schools have the resources they need to help them, to make sure that there is a strong research program, and that the national assessment stays strong as a kind of an overall accountability measure with no stakes attached to it. And I think that if the federal government were to keep those as its K-12 goals, that would be a huge role for it to fill. It's overreached its capacity. The bet that I had with Richard Rothstein several years ago, we made a wager, and I said that NCLB would be reauthorized with the testing left intact. And he said no one will support that because, first of all, the Republicans don't like, what is it that they don't like? I can't remember. He said that the Republicans don't support NCLB because it's too much federal intrusion, and the Democrats don't support it because they don't like all the testing. But I think that he was wrong. I think that I won the bet. He doesn't agree. He agrees that I won the bet, but he doesn't agree that I was right. I was right because Washington today, whether Republican or Democrat, shares the same narrative. And this has been my one of the things I find most frustrating. And that is, there used to be, back in the 90s, in the years when I was most involved in D.C., there was a clear party division. And this was true from, let's say, from the 1960s up until No Child Left Behind. The Democrats on one side were the party of equity, equitable funding, and support for professional development. The Republicans were the party of testing, accountability, and choice. Today, Democrats and Republicans support testing, accountability, and choice. There's no partisan divide anymore. So this is, I think, what is most frustrating to the people I speak to teachers, to parents, is they say, who do we appeal to in Washington? How do we get this country back on track so that the federal government does what it can do best, which is to redistribute resources where they're needed most, and so that states and localities can take responsibility for improving their schools because they're closest to them and they know best what their needs are. And there's no leadership. I don't know where to turn.
What about your thoughts on school choice?
Pardon?
On choice. Why is school choice so bad for the American public?
Why is school choice bad?
Yeah.
I don't think that school choice in itself is bad, but I think that if you break it down into vouchers and charters, vouchers have not worked. The promise of vouchers, if you go back and you look at the advocacy for them in the 1980s and 1990s, and I had a period of time where I flirted with the idea of vouchers for poor kids and failing schools, that it hasn't worked. And we've now had a 21-year experiment in Milwaukee that shows that the low-performing kids or the low-income kids in voucher schools don't do any better than low-income kids in the Milwaukee public schools. And both sectors, both the vouchers schools and the Milwaukee public schools, are doing terribly. And if you look at the scores of black students in both schools, whether you look at black students or low-income students, they're doing terribly, whether it's voucher or public schools. So all of this money in Wisconsin, they've spent over $1 billion on the voucher schools. Just think if the same amount of money and a tremendous amount of energy had been put into improving the public schools in every neighborhood, it might have made a difference. But vouchers have not made a difference. So, you know, voucher advocates at this point don't even seem to be saying that they expect to see better education. They look for other things. They say parents are more satisfied. Okay. Or they say, but it'll save money. And now with the expansion of vouchers in Wisconsin, they're saying it'll save money. That's the real goal.
So you, in Life and Death, in your book, you really took issue with the two tenets of No Child Left Behind, the testing and the school choice pieces of that.
Yes, but in No Child Left Behind, school choice was very weak, and Republicans were very critical of that. Actually, the choice provisions are far stronger in Race to the Top, because Race to the Top, this is where the Republican and Democratic lines become the same. Race to the Top requires that states remove or lift their caps on charter schools so that there will be a dramatic expansion of charters. And this is probably the most controversial position that I take, because I had supported charters. In 1998, I went to Albany and testified on behalf of New York State's charter legislation. I wrote articles in support of charters. I met with Albert Shanker in 1988 when he was first coming up with the idea of charters, and he tried to explain it and persuade me that this would be a great way to help the neediest kids. What he didn't realize until 5 years later, and what I realized later than that, was the charter sector would become not just for the neediest kids, but would, particularly under No Child Left Behind, it would be a sector that would not collaborate with public schools to make them better, but would compete with them to try to take away their resources and students. And their students. And that we now have charter chains that are incredibly entrepreneurial, where the CEOs are paid $300,000, $350,000, $400,000, $500,000. And most of the charter schools in the state of Michigan are for-profit charter schools. I read the other day 80% of the schools in Michigan are for-profit. Now we have cyber charter schools where the amount of money to be made is staggering, because the charter gets the same state tuition aid, and they don't supply anything but a computer and somebody monitoring a screen somewhere else. They don't have the cost of a brick and mortar building, no library, no playground, no nurses, no guidance counselors, none of that. And they're making tons of money, and the people involved in the cyber charter industry see this as an enormously profitable investment, and it is. So I've become critical of the charter movement because it's gone away from its original purpose. I could envision supporting charters that serve the neediest kids, but that's not what charters are doing today. There are some, but that's not what most of them are doing. Most of them are want to be able to say, we have the highest scores, we're better than you are, and we want your space, particularly in places where they're given public space, and part of their appeal is we're better. So there's a city in California that I read about recently, Inglewood, California, which had typically been pointed to by people on the right and saying, look, here's a poor district, poor kids, look at the great test scores. But Inglewood is now on the verge of collapse because they've had such a large charter explosion that if they've lost a third of their enrollment, and the district can't survive. They still have the same capital cost, and a third of their enrollment is gone. So they're, and with California's fiscal crisis, they're in terrible trouble. So there are just lots of problems that the charters have introduced, where they are actually, in many, many communities, at war with public education, competing with public education. And I would rather see a different scenario where charters exist to be laboratories of innovation to help public education, and especially to enroll the neediest and lowest performing students, not to compete with and boast of their great scores. And you know, the story just came out the other day about Chicago. It was just yesterday I got several emails. Chicago charters are doing no better than the regular public schools. That's the story almost everywhere.
Yeah, that's happening across the country.
And I think the public is finally beginning to get it, that just because the school has a different management, just because the teachers don't belong to a union, that doesn't mean those kids are going to do better.
You know, Mary notes that you call yourself the forgetful professor. Sometimes you sure don't sound like that. You've got your statistics and all your dates just like the back of your hand.
Yeah, but I'll forget every ordinary things having to do with
the house or whatever.
Right.